Hi, good morning. Before we begin, I would also like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I very much appreciated Joel Davison's welcome last night at the reception, and I hope I can also do my part in making you feel comfortable here. Hence, our speakers have already occupied the couch. We have taken it upon ourselves to hopefully have a conversation. Before I introduce them, I will just introduce myself. Oops. My name is Astrida Neimanis. I work here at the University of Sydney in the Department of Gender and Cultural Studies, but I was grown up by the lands and waters of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence watershed on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe of Turtle Island or Canada. And my own research is in feminist environmental humanities with a focus on water. And I'm very privileged and honored to be invited to chair this conversation today on gender and environment. So I have the pleasure of introducing to you, first of all, Professor Lesley Head, who is the head of the School of Geography at the University of Melbourne. She was previously an ARC Australian Laureate Fellow at the University of Wollongong and is known for her research on the implications of managing Australian landscapes that have been peopled for thousands of years. In the past decade or so, Lesley has focused on the cultural dimensions of environmental issues, including climate change, and her current collaborative research brings ethnic diversity into these debates. Lesley's latest book is Hope and Grief in the Anthropocene, published by Routledge in 2016. And beside Lesley, we have Sherilyn Macgregor, who is a reader in environmental politics at the University of Manchester, cross-appointed to the Department of Politics and the Sustainable Consumption Institute. She holds a PhD in environmental studies from York University in Toronto, but has spent the past 14 years in the UK. Sherilyn has written extensively on feminist ecological citizenship, how gender shapes the politics of climate change, and the connections and tensions between movements for social justice, feminism particularly, and movements for ecological sustainability. She is particularly interested in how citizens work together to challenge unfair systems and improve everyday life for marginalized people in rich countries. Sherilyn's most recent project, which she is co-producing with grassroots activists, looks at rubbish as political matter in the deprived and stigmatized inner city ward of Moss Side in Manchester. So let's give them a round of applause right now. Why not? Okay, so if you're at all awake or looking around you, you will know that it's a very good time to be talking about environment. And if you read the news at all, you probably have noticed it's also a very good time to be talking about feminism. So why not talk about these things together? It seems probably the perfect time. Of course, this discussion, though, is not new. It has been happening for decades. And probably for at least as long and longer than both these things have had names, feminism and environmental justice. So this morning, in the spirit of the conference, looking forward and looking back, I'm going to begin by asking each of our panelists this morning the same question. So looking back, what concepts, frameworks, or other contributions of past feminist scholarship do you think we need to be gathering, particularly right now, in the face of current environmental justice issues? And looking forward, what ideas have feminisms planted that we should be further cultivating? So in other words, what feminist contributions keep getting forgotten, and why might that matter? And also, though, what openings does feminist scholarship provide that we still need to amplify in relation to environmental justice more broadly? So now both of our speakers will provide some thoughts on these questions, and then we'll open it up to bring you into the conversation as well. And we'll begin with Sherilyn. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Astrida, for that introduction, and thank you to the conference organizers for the invitation, for the warm welcome, and for the generous hospitality. It's a great honor to be here and to be invited to the Keynote couch with Lesley and to have a conversation with all of you. And I think I'm going to try and answer those big questions that Astrida posed. But I want to use my 10 minutes or or so, to really reflect backwards and forwards on the three component parts of the title of the session: environmental justice, materiality, and gender. And to do so, I'm going to draw on the insights and contributions of a book that I recently edited that's just come out in July, the Routledge Handbook of Gender and Environment, which is part of the same series of handbooks that the Routledge Handbook on Environmental Justice is a part of, that we celebrated last night. And this handbook took me almost 3 years to put together, to curate, to collaborate, and to develop sort of 35 chapters on all kinds of different themes on gender and environment. And I want to just maybe start by reading the opening paragraph of the book, just to give you a sense of the what, the why, and the who. So the handbook represents the state-of-the-art of the academic field of gender and environment. One intention of the handbook is to showcase the variety of perspectives, themes, and debates that have shaped the intellectual project of trying to understand the gender-environment nexus within the social sciences and humanities over the last 3 or 4 decades. Another intention is to demonstrate that under the banner of gender and environment sits a diverse, theoretically sophisticated, and empirically grounded collection of approaches that have in common a set of concerns about gender injustice and the degradation of the natural environment. With some of its roots reaching into the fertile soil of activist movements, this scholarship, particularly within the tradition of ecological feminism, has been motivated by the pursuit of justice in the face of diverse and interlocking forms of oppression. But it has also contributed theoretical insights that in many cases were ahead of their time. Arguably, gender and environment scholarship was materialist and post-humanist before these concepts gained popularity or regained popularity in mainstream Western academia. An intersectional analysis of capitalism, colonialism, rationalist science, racism, misogyny, heterosexism, and speciesism has always been a central part of feminist ecological scholarship. And, contrary to popular opinion in many corners of environmental studies, this work has very little to do with the claim that women are closer to nature than men. In fact, much of it is aimed at questioning the very ideas of women and nature, and at understanding the myriad ways in which gender as a social category and a power relation shapes and is shaped by the interhuman relations as well as the human relations with other species and environments. Yet the idea that it is at base a simplistic narrative about women saving the planet persists in spite of all the evidence. The Routledge Handbook of Gender and Environment aims to dispense with this caricature once and for all. So those are fighting words, really, aren't they? So let me turn to the 3 component concepts in the title of the panel. As you can tell from what I've just read, justice has always been at the heart of the intellectual project of feminist environmentalism, and it shares many things in common with environmental justice scholarship. Probably the most notable one is the fact that feminist environmental justice has always tried to think about justice as a tripartite concept, so with distribution, recognition, and participation as important concepts within the notion of justice. But what is the relationship between environmental justice scholarship and feminist environmental scholarship? This is a question I'd like us to think about. And I think it would be really interesting to hear from the people who were at the Melbourne conference 20 years ago to hear what their memory of what that conversation might have been like about the relationship between, say, ecofeminism and environmental justice, and what you think about how this relationship has evolved over the last 20 years. Certainly, I find it interesting that in the 2 handbooks that I've just mentioned, the Handbook of Environmental Justice and the Handbook of Gender and Environment, there's one chapter in each handbook on the intersections of feminism and environmental justice. Greta Gard has written a chapter for Gordon's handbook on feminism and environmental justice, and Julie C. has written a chapter for my handbook called Gender and Environmental Justice. And they're very similar in many ways, and one of the things that they reflect on, looking back, is the lack of engagement between feminist scholarship and environmental justice scholarship, and the fact that race and class have tended to be the dominant social markers within environmental justice scholarship. So looking back, this lack of engagement is problematized by both of these authors. But looking forward, both of them have some sense of optimism that things are starting to change. And one of the things that Julie C. talks about is that there is evidence that there is a more sort of intersectional approach to environmental justice scholarship, particularly looking at how gender, race, and class intersect in activism around toxics, around reproductive rights, around things like asthma and air pollution. But the thing is, I also find it interesting that the three examples that she gives of this research is her own, the work of Bindi Shah, and the work of Giovanna Di Chiro, who are all feminist scholars. So I wonder about how optimistic we should really be. And by the same token, Greta Gard talks about the reasons for optimism and looking at the climate justice movement, the global climate justice movement, which is bringing together in a coalition and solidarity lots of different groups from different social categories and social identities, and that this is probably a good sort of change in the way we're understanding the relationship between feminist politics and environmental politics. However, I think there's also reason to be skeptical as well, and we need to do more research really to see what the gender politics within the climate justice movement really is. And there's some really interesting research done by a couple of early career scholars named Jo Curnow and Jody Chan, who are working within the climate justice movement in the US campuses, and they've done really interesting research to show that even within this very intersectional and multicultural movement of campus climate justice politics, white men still seem to dominate in how the organization of the campaigns, the who speaks for who leads. So I think that's an interesting kind of thing to reflect on. Materiality. Now, I don't know how materiality got in the topic. Oh God, 2 minutes. 1 minute on materiality, 1 minute on gender, but we can come back to these things. Okay, so the main thing I want to say about materiality is I don't know why it's in the title of this, because neither Lesley and I really write much on materiality, but materiality is still extremely important and has always been extremely important in feminist environmental scholarship. Looking back, materiality and materialism was really the connections with bodies, the connection with matter was at the heart of feminist critiques of capitalism and so forth. Women's concern for their bodies, their own bodies, the health of their bodies and the bodies of loved ones of all species was very much a catalyzing force for their activism. And we also see that the use of the term material ecofeminism was a deliberate attempt to try to connect feminist scholarship and Marxist scholarship to understand the importance of thinking about reproductive labor in mediating matter and human needs, nature and human needs. And Mary Meller's chapter in the handbook is a very good story of that, the development of that critique. The theme in the book that I would draw out, though, is that this sort of turn to new materialism, which seems to be a very popular trend over the last 10 years. This has caused a little bit of concern amongst ecofeminist scholars, and in fact, not just concern, but Kate Sandilands is infuriated by the way that new materialism tends to be built on forgetting and erasure of the contributions of ecofeminist scholarship since the very beginning. And it's similar to the critique that Sarah Ahmed has made of new materialism, that it can only sort of present itself as new if it erases the contributions of feminist science studies and the scholarship of Donna Haraway, which also plays a very important role in the handbook, and many chapters draw on Donna Haraway's work. Finally, gender. I'm going over time, I'm sorry. But I could say, there's so much I could say about how gender how gender appears, how it's taken up, how it's analyzed in the handbook. Looking back, we know that the beginnings of ecofeminist scholarship was really to look at women's experience, and gender was often treated as a single axis category, which then created a sense of exclusivity that ecofeminism was criticized for. However, recent work in the situation today, we can say that almost no ecofeminist scholarship uses a single-axis analysis uncritically. In fact, I don't think that that has happened since the early 90s, since the important work of Beena Agarwal, who talked about lessons from India and how some of the work that was being written in the late 80s was rather perhaps essentialist in the way it understood gender, but also the work of Kimberly Crenshaw on intersectionality, which is now pervasive in feminist scholarship on environment. The handbook demonstrates also that going forward, the contributions of queer ecologists, trans ecologists, people writing about non-Western gender systems, such as indigenous gender systems that are more kaleidoscopic and non-binary, and how these can help us understand human relationships with nature. I mean, these are the growing, kind of important and exciting contributions going forward. But the final frontier, and my final comment, what is the final frontier in gender and environment scholarship? Any guesses? Masculinity. We need to talk about masculinity, right? There's no chapters in the handbook on environmental justice on men. There's no man chapter. I had a really hard time finding someone to write the man chapter for the gender and environment handbook. There's not a lot of research. Masculinity remains, and particularly white, elite, hegemonic masculinity remains pretty much an unmarked category in environmental justice research, and I think that needs to change. So going forward, we need to think about how a better understanding of justice embraces an anti-androcentrism principle, and I take that from Nancy Fraser's definition of gender justice. And one of the most important principles of gender justice, according to Nancy Fraser, which does mark it out as different from other interpretations of justice, is that we can't really build a sense of social justice if men are at the center, if we have androcentric understandings of justice. So how do we think about an anti-androcentric environmental justice scholarship? How does environmental justice scholarship contribute to an anti-androcentrist struggle? I look forward to your thoughts. Thank you.
Fantastic. We'll hear those thoughts in a minute. And in the meantime, let's listen to Lesley.
Thanks, Astrida. And can I echo the various thanks for the organisers and our many welcomes. So several generations of feminist scholars have done a lot of work that we can use, as Sherilyn's just outlined. I would go back to Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. Her explanation of woman as other, published in 1949, is a very profound analysis that also helps us understand all the different kinds of othering relevant to environmental justice discussions. So we've just heard in the previous session about othering of species, in many of the sessions of the conference, Indigenous peoples. So this is othering against presumed norms. This work helps us analyse and understand all kinds of categorisations, including the category of species itself, as we've just heard in the previous session also. So Sherilyn has given us a great overview. I'm going to come in a little bit sideways here and ground my remarks in the example of our emotional responses to climate change. This connects to a number of comments I heard in the various sessions yesterday. In the course of writing about grief and hope, I went to interview some climate scientists. So here is a group of people whose day job is modelling the end of the world as we know it, and I wanted to know how they felt about this and how they experienced their emotional lives in relation to their work. So feminists have long argued that the emotional is missing in many accounts of the socio-spatial world. Feminist analyses of emotion have shown how it's viewed as being separate from and beneath the faculties of thought and reason. To be emotional in this understanding is to have one's judgment affected. It is to be reactive rather than active, dependent rather than autonomous. Instead, scholars such as Sarah Ahmed have shown how this is a false dichotomy and that being emotional does not imply irrationality. or Hilaire Koskela writing about reasoning as a strategy to contain fear in the context of women's personal safety. However, the attempt to separate emotion and reason was a common theme in my interviews with climate scientists. They spoke of the crucial importance of doing rigorous science as underpinning everything their work entailed and the basis of their professional reputations. One of them, who I call Jeff, described this as keeping the heart a long way from the brain. For Jeff, emotions were to be distanced from rational thinking in order to produce accurate and reliable data. In a similar way, Gary acknowledged the emotional dimensions of the scientific projections and data that he helped to produce, yet illustrated how he finds it necessary to actively eliminate these emotional dimensions, saying, "I would prefer to describe what constitutes a catastrophe rather dispassionately, without taking on the emotional impact of that." So the context in which these scientists are working, and they weren't all male scientists, but the context includes not only the masculinist science model, but also an intense public debate around their truth claims. They're constantly having to defend themselves and their work against climate change denialists. So they can only keep going by doing a huge amount of emotional labour to build on Ali Hochstral's concept. So here again is a concept from feminist scholarship that we can draw on here to understand what's going on. The scientists' emotional labour includes disciplining themselves against the norm of dispassionate science. They try and switch off at home. They don't talk about climate change with their kids. They don't talk about climate change with taxi drivers. And they don't talk in social situations about the fact that they're a climate scientist. They also engage in what one of them called compulsory optimism. So how can we connect this to us and to what we're talking about here at the conference? What are the consequences of all this? Apart from the fact that I did feel that some of these poor old climate scientists might feel better if they read some of Sarah Ahmed's work. One consequence is that it contributes to what Kane and Bruce and her co-authors call erring on the side of least drama. Their work shows how the dispassionate norm in science leads to scientists being biased not towards alarmism, but rather the reverse. There's a kind of systematic downplaying of the likelihood of catastrophe. In another example, Lauren Rickards and her colleagues identified strong parallels between masculinism, rationality and optimism in their analysis of how senior decision makers respond to climate change. But as Katrina McKinnon says, it is not obvious that people in despair about tackling climate change are making a mistake. Rather, we could suggest that they are taking a rational approach to managing their emotional responses. So the conventional wisdom is that fear and pessimism won't do it. We actually saw this yesterday in the discussion. There was a question to one of the panels, what do we do? The panel was a bit stumped. I think it included a suggestion, let's go to Mars. But they urged us to stay positive, be optimistic. The labour of optimism and its companion, the suppression of doom and gloom, conform to feeling rules frequently observed in Western culture. The expectation to manage emotions, to remain optimistic, and to thus emphasise pleasurable emotions over painful ones. So I've argued instead that we in the affluent West are grieving for the loss of modernity and its investment in a future characterised by hope. It's difficult to discuss grief and associated negative emotions because of strong cultural pressure to be optimistic and positive. So I want to reject the cultural assumption that even to canvass these issues is to give in to them or to give up or to assume the worst. Instead, I would say that a relentless cultural disposition to focus disproportionately on positive outcomes in the face of rational evidence to the contrary is itself a kind of denial. So I argue that grief is a companion that will increasingly be with us, and more open acknowledgement of that fact will strengthen rather than weaken our collective capacities. So what then does that make hope? Hope, I don't have time to talk about that fully, but hope is a risky and complex process of possibility. In particular, I suggest we need to decouple hope and optimism and recognise that a broader range of emotions, including painful ones, are entangled in hope. Hope is conceptualised then, and again this draws on a history of feminist scholarship, as embodied practice. It is something to be practiced rather than felt. So one difference to 1997 is that the future looks much less certain than it did 20 years ago. We have to expect surprises, we have to expect dramatic thresholds of change and unfolding catastrophes. But you don't need to be explicitly working on gender issues to draw on a number of tools from feminist scholarship to help us think about these issues. Thank you very much.
Right, so we need to talk about white elite masculinity, and we need to talk about our feelings. There might be a connection. Okay, so, and who has time for hope? Yeah, no, that's fantastic, fantastic. I would love to hear your questions now to these two wonderful provocations. So who wants to begin? That's right. As Sherilyn just pointed out, not just questions, but comments, thoughts, your own provocations or your own responses are all very welcome.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Petra. Thank you very much to both of you. My question, at least to get started with, is for Lesley, but Sherilyn, please feel free to jump in. So one thing we know about climate change and climate change communication is that negativity and gloom doesn't work to change people's behavior or attitude or understanding of climate change. Now, I really feel sorry for all the climate scientists who, on the one hand, and I heard you, Lesley, very well, are stuck in their compulsory optimism, but at the same time, know that in order to communicate the seriousness and the urgency of climate change, cannot fall back into gloom and pessimism, because that's precisely the way we do not reach the general public. So how do we as climate scientists actually communicate? How do we manage our very, very many feelings in the moment of an interview? What is it we say? What is it we do not say? What are the trigger words we have to avoid and still stay true to ourselves and our knowledge?
Thanks, Petra. Yeah, obviously this is a very, very difficult issue. I think I want to just contest this conventional wisdom that fear and pessimism won't do it. Nothing else is doing it either. So part of my argument is that there's a denial in our failure to grieve, and I think we do need to think about rituals of mourning and of loss, and there's a big role, for example, for museums in helping us think about what is it we're going to lose, and of course the big question here is who is the we that we're talking about. So there are many different we's and there's different scales and levels of loss. So I don't know how a climate scientist in the midst of a TV or radio interview needs to respond, but I think they could start by acknowledging that the task is more difficult than we've acknowledged, basically.
All right, I've seen 4 hands, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll just keep my eye out for you. So please, yeah.
Hi, thank you. My name's Siobhan. Thank you both for your talk, and this is a question for you, Lesley. I read something recently which was talking about the one of the elephants in the room in especially activist circles being that, and what you were saying really reminded me of that, but being that deep down, like, we have this unspoken secret that none of us actually want to say aloud, which is that, like, maybe the other world that we're dreaming of like isn't actually possible or is extremely improbable. And I was extremely challenged by this because I've been trying to think about hope and how to be hope in improbable times. But I was just wondering, it's not really a question, but whether either of you have any ideas about that, and whether it's useful to air these like secret fears that we have about the real improbability of saving the world. Sorry to be a downer. Okay, thank you.
I think that's a really important point, and we should also think that the notion of saving the world is part of the Enlightenment project, or the hope of modernity, that there's some kind of perfection that we're getting to. I think I've come to think of the future much more as a patchwork of possibilities and experiments, some of which will fail, many of which will fail probably, but we don't necessarily know in advance which ones they're going to be. That all sorts of people and communities need to try all sorts of different things. So that's one way it helps me think about it.
One concept that I like that some ecofeminists who write about climate change are using is insurgent vulnerability, and the idea that instead of talking about resilience all the time and the need for resilience, we should actually just admit that we are vulnerable, we are fragile, and to use that as a way into activism, and think insurgent vulnerability as a way to embrace that and to say, yeah, we're all going to die. I mean, that's life. I mean, that's life. We die, right? And just use that as a way into politics rather than to try and mask it with this sort of human exceptionalist kind of discourse of like the resilience discourse kind of is.
Right. Thank you. Yes, please.
Well, thank you too both for very wonderful and inspiring presentations. First question to Sherilyn, and maybe you could also comment on it, Lesley. What does feminist literature has to say about global environmental justice or international justice? The second question I have is, Lesley, could you please tease out a little bit more? You came tantalizingly close to trying to disentangle hope and optimism. I didn't quite get what your argument there. It seems to me that, optimism stems from hope, and that you will have a difficult time separating both. And then also, would you be happy to be challenged on the assumption that you made that optimism is Western Enlightenment culture? Because Professor Katrina Brown recently was making a presentation about how different cultures respond and build resilience. And she found actually that in a small rural community in Kenya, they tended to engage more through dance, emotion, and optimism and joy, whereas in Devon, the predominant emotion of engagement was more about grief. But you appear to be homogenizing and I think actually making a very problematic assumption. Oh, by the way, let me end on a positive note that I agree with you in your response to Petra's point, that actually optimism hasn't done it. And so we need much more blunt truth.
More questions? Yeah, okay, we're going to gather up a few questions because there are many hands up. So right in front here in the plaid, and then over there by the windows, and then there was one in the back there with glasses on. Yeah, we'll get these next three questions before we start to answer. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Mike Joy from New Zealand, and I'm known as an outspoken scientist. So I'm a bit like a climate scientist, but I'm working with fresh water and I'm dealing with the facts and the doom and gloom. And I kind of, I wear my heart on my sleeve, I guess, in lots of public. And so I'm criticised by other scientists for that. That's not scientific. to be emotional in any way, and they criticise me for that. When it comes to hope, because I battle with this, I struggle with teaching my students and telling them the reality. It's such a hard thing to do. And I think it was Derek Jensen or someone like that. He said, go sit on the road somewhere and hope that lunch will come. You'll sit there hoping until you die. So kind of, I mean, as an academic, and I guess a lot of you are the same, where there's this terrible dilemma where you're writing about this stuff and you know about this stuff, and you're in an academic system where you're punished for speaking out too loudly. Well, I don't know if you are, but I am at the moment for speaking out. So I'm just saying, don't hope, do something. We have to be activists. We can no longer sit around having conferences and talking about it without all becoming activists as well. And so I don't know how do we do that without our systems, throwing us out for being active? Because I think it's past the time of talking. We have to act.
Thank you. And then we'll take your question or comment.
Yeah. So I wonder if it's not what we say or even what we're supposed to do, but how we say it and how we do it. This is related to the comment about dancing as well. I mean, one of the things I was curious about that you didn't mention was the testimonial and personal dimension of feminism, which seems important to me because it situates us in relationships. That's the how. And like when you talk about like white masculinity, it's about self-ownership. And it's about its reified relation to a system of property and colonialism and domination. And it's actually like, this was my problem with the anthropocentrism point as well. It's internalizing reification. We should not call anthropocentrism the way it's being used. Similarly, I wonder if we should focus on the modality of relationship, of ways of relating, as a way of trying to deal with the reification of self-ownership that's at the heart of, say, gender categories, but also it's imbricated in the entire system of capital. So I wondered what you thought about the testimonial tradition, and again, for the sake of showing a how we do things, a how we relate to things. I was curious about that.
Okay, why don't we gather up a couple of responses from Lesley and Sherilyn, and then I know there are at least 2 more questions.
Okay, well, lots of things to respond to there. Thank you for your thoughts. And can I say, if you're interested in hope and grief, there is a session this afternoon that Manfred Lenson and I are organising, so please come along to that session. But to the point about whether a particular framing of optimism is a particularly Western construct, I think that's a really interesting comment, and I'm not necessarily saying that it's only experienced in so-called Western societies, but I think it is very much a product of modernist thinking and the way in which modernism has framed the future, and that's the way in which I talk about it in the book. On the question of hope and optimism, to connect those two comments, I've come to think of optimism as the feeling and hope as the practice, the things that we need to do. So it might be the things we need to do in the face of catastrophe, but that provides a way of living and a way of going forward. And there I'm drawing particularly on the work of geographer Ben Anderson, if anyone's familiar with that work.
Yeah, I mean, just really, I think in the interest of time, I still am interested to hear some reflections and answers from the audience on the question that I posed. I'm not sort of trying to dodge some of the questions, but I think I'm still interested to hear people's thoughts on the role of environmental justice scholarship in challenging androcentrism in the environmental, social sciences, and humanities. And that's sort of a project that I'm sort of involved in, and recently editing a collection of essays. It's an online journal published by the Rachel Carson Center called Environment and Perspectives on Environment and Society. It's an open source journal, and there's a collection of essays on masculinity and environmental change with a interesting foreword by Raewyn Connell, who's I know here at the University of Sydney. But I am really genuinely interested to hear what people think about what the relationship is and how it has evolved between ecofeminist scholarship and environmental justice scholarship, and how both projects engage with questions of global justice and local justice.
Okay, we do have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask that you've had your hand up for quite a while. Sorry, right behind. I'm sorry, she's had her hand up for longer. If you don't mind, just passing the mic. Yes, to you. Sorry, I don't know your name. Oh, you have one. Great. For 1, 2, and then does anyone else have a comment? 3. Okay, and then we'll have a final response from the panel.
I had a comment and a question. I'm a relatively new environmental lawyer, but a much longer history in working around violence against women and children. And it struck me that there's probably a lot of really interesting cross-fertilisation between feminists working against violence and feminists working in the science and environmental justice space. Although I don't know that we do the rituals of grieving any better. I think there'd be a really interesting conversation to be had about that. My question is, in relation to the work you did, Lesley, with the climate scientists, were there any hints, like even proto-discourses from them where they might have given a hint that they approached it differently from that binary? And I'm thinking of early feminist scientists like Evelyn Fox Keller and A Feeling for the Organism, and whether any of that sort of got into the scientists you talked to.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, thanks.
Well, thank you. Good morning. I'm Etam Can from KTH Environmental Humanities Lab. Well, first, a very quick point about Lesley's talk on hope and optimism. There is this really, really nice book of Terry Eagleton called Hope Without Optimism, and I think there he makes the case for the separation that hope in itself also carries this whole idea of defeat and kind of facing and confronting and accepting defeat as well. So I think that could be one way to go about. But since Sherilyn, you mentioned humanities and Rachel Carson Center, that rang a bell because I have a background in engineering, then I've done human geography and ended up in a environmental humanities division. And I see that my colleagues constantly engage with this notion of ruins. So we talk about Anthropocene in ruins, X in ruins, Y in ruins. So there is this constant leitmotif, particularly also in reflection with gender. So I was kind of wondering, what is your take on this use of ruins in terms of connecting EJ scholarship and gender? Do you see any connection between there?
Interesting question. And there is a final question or comment in the front. You had your hand up? Yep. It's not on.
Sorry about that. Nick Lowe from the University of Melbourne, Lesley. I believe it's impossible to talk about injustice without engaging emotion. And I'm just thinking of you've talked about the climate scholarship and climate science. And I think scientists simply have to, it seems to me, to have to suspend their emotions, rather like surgeons do when they're operating on the body. But the whole discourse of justice, I think, brings in the emotional level. I'm just thinking of one famous justice scholar, John Rawls, and I seem to remember him saying that he had to sort of modulate between the intellect and emotions to develop a theory of justice. It's not really a question, but do you agree with me that if we turn to environmental justice, we may find on both the masculine and feminine side more engagement with emotion?
Thank you very much for your comments, and I'll give an opportunity to Lesley and then Sherilyn for some final reflections.
Thanks very much for all those comments. I can't possibly do justice to them quickly. But just to maybe connect the environmental law question and Nick's comment here, and I would take us back to our friend Mike from New Zealand, whose great paper I heard yesterday. So within the climate scientists, there is a division between those who are mathematical physicists and those who are ecologists and earth scientists. And I think on the ecologists and earth scientists side, there is much more actual articulation of the reasons they got into it in the first place. I think in some ways this is an extreme example, and we need to remember that in the Australian context in particular, but also the US context, these people are stuck in the headlights of this absolutely relentless kind of climate denialism that is kind of forcing the binary that they would probably be interested to resist, I think. As to whether environmental justice scholarship is better at doing this, potentially, that's true, but I think there's also still that constant shift that we all go through between reason and emotions, and we need kind of better tools to think about the relationships between those two things.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lesley.
I don't want the last word. I'm looking forward to conversations over coffee. I think it's better to keep them going. I guess the thing that struck me in listening to Jeremy's point about testimonial and personal, and the other point about the importance of bringing, emotion. I mean, the thing that you have to remember is that when women activists have used emotion and testimonial and personal concerns and care for loved ones as their entree into environmental activism, they've been kind of dismissed and categorized as hysterical and irrational. And so the stakes are really high for feminism to constantly, try and, it's a very double-edged sword, I suppose, that we need to value the importance of affective labor and affect at the same time that there is a lot of risks in being associated with that, and that's the only kind of politicized entry into politics. So I think Astrida is also somebody who can comment on that. So maybe I'll pass it over to you, because you've been writing about this kind of thing.
Well, that's a little passing the buck, but fair enough. I do believe we have to wrap up now, but maybe in summary, I would just say it was very interesting to hear so many of you from the floor asking questions about, what do we do? How do we do need to talk about emotions. How do we bring this in? When we do, it's considered irrational. Sherilyn mentioned the high stakes for that. And I guess to bring back to this question we began the panel with, there's decades of amazing scholarship on exactly this point. It comes from intersectional feminist and queer scholars writing about the need to think about the binary between mind and body, the emotional and rational, critiques of science. The work is there, and the question is, why aren't we using it? So thank you very much for listening, and very much to our esteemed guests. And we look forward to continuing these chats.